Hey everyone, welcome back for some more standard content here on MTG Arena. And today I'm actually going to do an analysis of a few of the games that I played for the qualifier play-in. This past weekend's Arena qualifier was standard, and the play-in happened on Friday. I did not already have an invitation to the qualifier weekend, so I needed to partake in the play-in. Unfortunately, the play-in did not go well for me. I had enough coins and gems in my account to afford 2 runs. Neither run was successful, and I also only won 1 game in each run. The best of 3 format for the qualifier play-ins is a little bit brutal because you have to get 4 wins, and if you get 1 loss, you're kicked out, so you have to win 4 matches straight. But I didn't even get close. Maybe I had some performance anxiety, maybe I was a bit tired, or maybe I just had an off day. But there is a way to still get value from this experience by looking back and analyzing my play to see if there's anything else that I could have done differently. I'm hoping that by doing this, it will not only benefit me, but also prove to be a beneficial viewing experience for you. So, the deck that I used for my first run was my Orzhov Pixie deck. I put out a poll on my channel, and the overwhelming majority wanted to see more Orzhov Pixie, so that's what I tried. The Orzhov Pixie archetype has gained a lot of traction the past few weeks, but the deck lists that have been circulating the internet are quite different from the one that I posted in my video about a month ago. I'm not going to go through a very detailed deck text since this version of deck is not that different from that one, but I'm going to put a link to that video in the description so that you can go and watch it in the event that you want a more detailed deck tech. So here is the deck list that I ran for the play-in. I'm going to focus mostly on the things that are different. Still 4 copies of Scavenger, Hexmates, Zenith, and Annex as the core of the deck. Still 3 copies of Pixie and Kieran, but I have dropped a copy of Deep Cavern Bat in place of another copy of Momentum Breaker. With the rise of Mono Red, Deep Cavern Bat just is not as viable as it used to be because it just dies to Nova Hellkite, they get back their thing that you took, and then they can just attack for 4 damage. It also dies very easy to Fire Magic along with some Pearl Kieran, and that's one of the things that I was kind of considering with this build is I do need to make it a little bit more viable against these red spells. So adding another copy of Momentum Breakers, since there are a lot of creatures now between Mono Green and Simic and Mono Red and all this stuff, it does feel like it was a better adjustment. I also took out the Sage of the Skies in place for Elegy Acolyte. Sage of the Skies is still really good in this deck, but Elegy Acolyte simply is a better blocker. It's harder to remove because it has 4 toughness, so it doesn't die to a Braid, it doesn't die to Scorching Dragonfire or Lightning Strike, and you gain 4 life off it as opposed to the 2 life from Sage of the Skies. Even though if you double spell with Sage, you do get 2 copies of it, and that's a way that you could potentially gain 4 life, but still, Elegy Acolyte is just a little bit more reliable as a blocker. Obviously, Elegy Acolyte is just good in this deck anyway because you can trigger Void, but the reason why I didn't include it in my original deck list is because with the reduced copies of Pixie and Kieran, only running 6 of them in total, I wasn't able to trigger Void as often, not every single turn necessarily, and that's when Elegy Acolyte really gets the values, if you're triggering Void every single turn. But using it as just a really good blocker for lifelink that could potentially draw you a card, but then also potentially trigger Void, it seems to be the better option here in a meta that has shifted to be a bit more aggressive. In a similar vein, I took out the copy of Bitter Triumph because you don't want to have to pay 3 life if you're already behind in life because Mono Red is beating you down, and instead put in a copy of Get Lost. The reason why I didn't include Get Lost in my original deck list and had the Bitter Triumph instead is because the creatures in this deck are a little bit small until you get Zenith and Scavenger going, and then the creatures can grow. So if you're giving your opponent just 2 map tokens, that's actually a way that their creatures can just get bigger than yours, and now you don't have reliable blocks anymore, you can't get in for damage. So that's why I was running the Bitter Triumph instead. But now, just having to pay that 3 life because maybe you don't want to discard a card, it's really bad with how aggressive the meta has gone. So instead, I've shifted to include a copy of Get Lost. The lands are mostly the same, except I took out 2 copies of Shadowy Backstreet and just made room for 2 more basics instead. Again, the format is faster now, so having a bunch of tap lands actually did prove to be a problem, even though there was some room here to play a tap land like on turn 3 or potentially like turn 6 even, or even just turn 1. There are a number of changes to the sideboard, so I've included a copy of Devout Decree, which was previously not in here, but again, with the rise of mono red, this now hits more targets. The Exercise, Rest in Peace, Voice of Victories, these are the same as it was before. Still have a copy of Sage of the Skies in here, and what I'll do is if I'm going up against an aggressive deck, it could be Simic, Stompy, Mono Green, Mono Red, any of those things, then I'll cut at least one copy of Annex, sometimes more, and make room for this copy of Sage, and then potentially something else. Seam Rip, 2 copies of the rest. This is the same as it was before, but I did make room for a copy of Intimidation Tactics. I also do have a copy of Bitter Triumph in here. This is mostly for Kaido, but it could also be for Blue-White Control if they're running Elspeth. An extra copy of Shoot the Sheriff. I think this is the same as it was before, but then a notable change here is 2 copies of Sunset Saboteur. So the way that I made room for these Saboteurs and the Intimidation Tactics was I took out the Tiny Bones Joins Up. Tiny Bones Joins Up was really good against control decks or even artifact decks that go a little bit slower, but the meta is just faster now, so having those Tiny Bones, it really wasn't providing the value. This Sunset Saboteur though, I'm seeing a lot of value from this. So this guy serves 2 purposes. One is that it is a way for the deck to get a little bit more aggressive if you happen to match up against a slower deck. But more often, I'm only going to put this guy in on the draw, because if I'm going up against Dimir Midrange or Mono Red, this guy is an excellent blocker. And not only that, if your opponent tries to target him with removal, or a Nova Hellkite, or a Floodpits Drowner, or a Kaido -2, any of those things, then they're going to have to discard a card because of the ward. So many cards in Dimir midrange target, even Beastbinder targets. So having this ward that penalizes your opponent for targeting is really a good momentum stopper against those decks. Similar thing to Mono Red, because this guy has enough power to block so many of their creatures, and if they want to remove it, then they're going to have to discard a card. And if they have no cards in hand, which is possible, then they can't even do it. So that's when the Saboteur goes in. It's when I'm on the draw and I need a really good blocker that penalizes the opponent for targeting and removing this blocker. It's not a good blocker against Simic Stompy or Mono Green because they do have trample and the 1 toughness just doesn't get it done. But I think that this card is going to see a lot more play, and I think people are sleeping on it just a little bit. I've seen it in a few deck lists, but I think it's going to be played a bit more. It's an excellent option for when you're on the draw against a potentially aggressive deck, or it's just a way for your deck to get more aggressive if you're going up against a slower deck or a control deck or whatever. Now, I do want to discuss a couple cards that I was considering putting in here, but I ultimately did not. One of those is Enduring Innocence. I also didn't have Enduring Innocence in my previous deck list. One of the reasons I don't have Enduring Innocence is that not every single creature here triggers it. So if I play Spiteful Hexmage, even if Spiteful Hexmage gets the roll token put on him, he doesn't trigger Innocence because he has a power of 3. The Demon from Unholy Annex doesn't trigger it either because of the power of 6. The previous deck list had Sage of the Skies in the main, which could trigger it, but with LG Acolyte, that doesn't trigger it either. Now, the robots from LG Acolyte do. However, I did feel that there were these cases where I had Enduring Innocence and I played a creature and I didn't draw a card off, and I just felt like, well, this isn't providing quite as much value as I thought. And again, with the 1 toughness, it just dies to Nova Hellkite. Granted, it does still remain on the field as an enchantment, but now you can't block with it anymore. It dies very easily to Fire Magic. It is potentially something that could replace a couple copies of Unholy Annex, so that is maybe something that I'll return to in a future build. Another card missing from this whole 75 is Sheltered by Ghosts. I did have a copy of Sheltered in the sideboard of my previous build, but I don't have it here. I honestly felt like Sheltered by Ghosts was a little bit underwhelming. Again, a lot of creatures here can die to Fire Magic, and that doesn't have to target to get rid of it, so the ward doesn't trigger. There's also a big rise in people playing Nowhere to Run. Not only the Pixie decks, but other deck lists that run black are also playing copies of Nowhere to Run, and and that also gets through the ward. But not only that, Sheltered by Ghosts is a really strong card in an aggressive deck, like a Boros or a mono white that's really aggressive, because now you're getting in for tons of damage early on, hopefully, and then you can take one of the opponent's things, hit for even more damage, and gain some life. So it's a really big turnover if you draw that card. But in a slower deck that's a little bit more mid-range based, it's not quite as valuable, because sure, I'm going to take your Kaido, but now it's turn 4 or turn 5, and you have the mana to just pay the remove my creature and pay the ward anyway, and now you get your Kaido back. So without getting in for a lot of damage early on, I didn't think that the Sheltered by Ghosts was providing as much value as I was hoping. So those are the changes to the deck. So now I'm going to move on to the gameplay, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to show the match that I lost. The match that I won, I actually did play pretty well. I was up against Azorius Artifacts, but I think it's going to be a better learning experience to review the match that I lost in a lot of detail. So that's what I'm going to do. I lost against Dimir Midrange 1-2, and I'm going to spend a lot of time discussing the choices that I made and what I should have done instead that would have been better options. Bit of a different video, but I'm hoping that it provides some value for you and proves to be a good viewing experience. Let's move on to the gameplay. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the match against Dimir Midrange. This actually does look pretty good. I can start with the Momentum Breaker. I have 2 Pixies to bounce it, and I do have an Annex as some top end. I am unfortunately on the draw, and against Dimir Midrange that can potentially be a problem if they get off to an aggressive start. And for that reason, I actually was debating just playing one of these Pixies, even without being able to bounce something, and it would just be a 1/1 flyer. I decided not to. Obviously, my opponent could just play a Floodpitch Drowner and then get in for damage anyway, but it was tempting to do that, just have something on the field. But a 1/1 flyer, you know, if they play a Spyglass Siren and then it gets buffed on the map token, that's not really that great, right? So it does seem like they're holding a Floodpitch Drowner here, and you notice how I'm holding full control. I pretty much did that for all of my games in these runs in which I had untapped mana. I just didn't want to give my opponent any information at all, so I just always held full control as long as I had untapped mana. So now playing Momentum Breaker is actually not a bad choice. It forces them to discard a card, and since I have 2 Pixies, I can keep picking it up. I actually think that Momentum Breaker has proven to be more valuable than I was expecting. I only had 2 copies of it in my first deck list. I think it is more viable to run 3 or even 4 in these Pixie bounce decks, because it forces them to either discard a card or sacrifice a creature. So they do have a Floodpitch Drowner. I was correct. And here it comes. They're going to Ninjutsu and Kaido on turn 3. So I am just way behind. It would be even worse if my opponent started with a Spyglass Siren. Kaido is just such a strong turn 3 play when you're, especially if you're on the play. It just puts you so far ahead. So now I don't really have very good options, and one of the issues with Momentum Breaker is that it's not good against Dimir Midrange. Your opponents can just flash in a Floodpitch Drowner at the end of their turn, or at the end of your turn, and with Kaido ninjutsuing things, then those creatures are not on the field anymore to be sacrificed. Playing Unholy Annex here is not a very good option either, because I'm already behind in life and it would just set me even further back. So this is a situation where Enduring Innocence actually might be a good option, because I could play Enduring Innocence, it would get tapped down by Floodpitch Drowner, but then I could bounce it with Pixie and then replay it on my 4th turn, and I would draw a card off it. As it is, I'm just going to play Pixie. I'm going to bounce the Momentum Breaker, but I'm not going to play it because all it's going to do is make my opponent discard a card. That doesn't seem like very good value. It's probably better to wait and try to hit one of their creatures with it. But again, Enduring Innocence actually would be very useful in this situation. My opponent's going to attack, and there's no point in blocking here. I'm at least hoping that I can get my other Pixie on the field and build some kind of board. And then I'm not going to play this Annex until I have the Ritual Chamber open. So if anything, I would play the Ritual Chamber first before opening the Annex. My opponent plays an Azure Beastbinder. now they're holding Flood Pitch Drowner. If I play this Momentum Breaker, then they'll play the Flood Pitch Drowner, tap down my Pixie, and sack the Drowner. But unfortunately, I don't really have another option. You know, I should play this Restless Fortress because it always comes in tapped to be a little mana efficient, play the Momentum Breaker, and then bounce it with my other Pixie. So that's exactly what's happening. There is an argument to be made here that maybe playing Annex on turn 3, even though it would have drained me for 2 life for a couple turns, it might have been the better choice because it would have at least given me, if I potentially could have found an answer to this Kaido or find an answer to just the board that my opponent is making. Azure Beastbinder targets one of my Pixies. I still can't really block here. My opponent plays a Preacher, which is certainly very scary, and they still have 2 mana open. Now I drew a Spiteful Hexmage, so if I had played that Annex on turn 3, I would have gotten this Spiteful Hexmage a turn sooner. I don't necessarily need to play this Ritual Chamber. I can play Momentum Breaker, play the Hexmage, put the roll token on one of my Pixies, and then I at least have a 3/2 blocker and my opponent is forced to sacrifice a creature. So what I'm going to do first here is go to combat and see what my opponent does, if anything. My opponent plays a Flood Pitch Drowner. They're going to tap down my Pixie. So this kind of thwarts my plan because I don't have very good blockers, and if I'm Momentum Breaker, they're just going to sack the Flood Pitch Drowner. So I'm still going to play the Momentum Breaker and the Hexmage, but this actually feels like the wrong move at this point. As soon as my opponent played that Flood Pitch Drowner, this Momentum Breaker is not providing much value anymore, and neither would that Hexmage for that matter. So it would have been better at this point to play the Ritual Chamber and get my Demon. I was a little bit afraid that the Demon could get removed, but if that happens, so be it. They could tap it down with Kaido, but if that happens, so be it. Just playing this Momentum Breaker and this Hexmage doesn't do anything. At least playing the Ritual Chamber forces my opponent to react, because right now they don't even have to do anything to me either. They can just attack and draw a card, and that's it. I don't have very good blocks here. So really playing that Momentum Breaker and that Hexmage, it was not the right thing to do as soon as I saw that Flood Pitch Drowner. I still don't have good blocks here. I mean, I would just prevent 3 damage or 2 damage. That's really not very good at all. Playing the Ritual Chamber there also just would have been a really good use of my mana because I could have had 5 mana available with one of the basic lands. My opponent would have had to tap down the Demon or remove it or something, so they wouldn't have been able to draw a card off Kaido here, and Kaido would only have 2 loyalty. And I drew a Momentum Breaker. So that means that on this turn, I could have played Spiteful Hexmage and double Momentum Breaker, because that breaker that's on the field I would have had in my hand. My opponent would have had the Beastbinder, a Preacher, and a Flood Pitch Drowner. I'm not sure if they drew that second Preacher off of the Kaido. I feel like they did. So they might have only had the Beastbinder, the Preacher, and a Drowner, and I could have double Momentum Breakered and played Spiteful Hexmage. I would have still had a tapped Demon on the field or whatever, but still, that would have been a much better turn 6 here for me. I could have played the Godless Shrine tapped, not take the damage from that, and at least get rid of 2 of my opponent's creatures. So that definitely would have been the better sequence. But as it is, my only real play is to open up the Ritual Chamber, which is not going to do anything. I'm just dead on board because they can tap it down with Kaido and then attack with Soulstone Sanctuary, and that's it. There's also, again, the potential that I could have played that Unholy Annex on turn 3. I would have been a few cards deeper here, so I would have gotten that second Momentum Breaker a couple turns sooner, which may have made a difference. But I would also be down some life. I could have potentially played that double Momentum Breaker or something and then opened up the Ritual Chamber and then start gaining some life back. Now my opponent plays a Flood Pitch Counter, and it's just very over. They can activate the Sanctuary, tap down one of my creatures with Kaido, and it's just... So I do think I could have played better there, but at the same time, I was in a really tough position because I was on the draw against Dimir Midrange that basically curved out perfectly. So I can't be too upset. So now we move on to sideboarding. Putting in Sage of the Skies does seem like a decent option here, especially if I'm on the play, because Dimir Midrange doesn't play as many flyers as it used to. I also didn't see a Deep Cavern Bat there. It's possible that they could have it, but I saw Azure Beastminder and Flood Pitch Drowner, so they might not have Deep Cavern Bat. Certainly going to put in Bitter Triumph. Probably a good idea to put in Devout Decree as well. The Momentum Breakers are not good here against Dimir Midrange for the reasons that I explained before. So this seems like a pretty good sideboard. And again, I'm not going to put in the Sunset Saboteur because I don't want to buff my opponent's creatures. So he's a great blocker on defense if I'm on the draw, but on the play against Dimir Midrange, just buffing up their creatures, it's just not a good thing to do against this deck. I didn't want to make too many changes to my deck now that I'm on the play, but there is an argument to be made to like put in Intimidation Tactics. That's pretty good against their deck. But on the play, I want to not compromise the strength of my deck because I want to push for full advantage here if I happen to get a good hand or something like that. This is my opening hand for game 2, which doesn't look that good. 5 lands and 2 plays, 2 1 mana plays. This does not seem like it's going to cut it. I can Shadowy Backstreet to surveil for something, and then next turn play Scavenger and Seamrip if they play a Cecil or a Spyglass Siren, but still, it's just not a very good opening hand. I took a long time to think about this, but really I didn't have to. You know, this is just not a good enough hand. This hand is also not good enough, unfortunately. 2 Unholy Annexes and only 1 land. That is not going to cut it either, so I also need to mulligan this. I took a long time to decide on this mulligan, and really I shouldn't have. I should have just done it right away because now I only have a little bit of time to decide on what to keep here, and it's not an easy decision. You know, look at this. I'm really scrambling here, and I got rid of my Zenith, which probably wasn't a very good idea. You know, I could have potentially dropped like this one of these other spells, but as it is, this also isn't bad. I wanted to keep the Hex Mage and the Kirin for sure, because if I play the Hex Mage and put a token, then the Kirin can bounce that token and draw me a card. So that's why I wanted to keep the Kirin and the Hex Mage. But I think I could have gotten rid of that Pixie and potentially kept the Zenith. But really just taking too long on that second hand there with the 1 land and the 2 annexes, I should have just mulliganed that right away. So starting with a Deep Cavern Bat on turn 2 does feel like a pretty good choice, and my opponent's hand is kind of loaded, but there's no removal. So potentially whatever I take here could stay under this bat for a few turns. So taking Kaido is a good choice. My opponent's clearly just holding up Flood Pitch Drowner, and I drew a 3rd land, which is very good. So now I can play Hex Mage, and then I can play Kirin, and I can bounce that roll token to draw another card. So it's actually not looking too bad. It's not great, you know, having so few cards in my hand, but I am able to get something going. My opponent plays their Flood Pitch Drowner, taps down my bats. Now I can play the Hex Mage and put the token on the bat. The bat also has base toughness 1/1, so the roll token is no penalty at putting it on that creature. But now I'm going to wait for my opponent's turn before bouncing this token with Kirin. So now I'm going to play Kirin, bounce that roll token, and draw a card. I drew an Optimistic Scavenger, which is not bad, and then I drew an Annex, which is also not bad. So playing this Annex on this turn does not seem very good. It would be better to play this Annex after I already have Scavenger on the field. So there's actually something really interesting that I can do here. I can play Scavenger and Pixie, and I can bounce this Hexmage and then replay it. So now when the Scavenger triggers, I can put a ++1 counter on something. So that's what I'm going to do. Now the roll token comes down and Scavenger triggers. I decided to put the counter on the Hexmage because now the Hexmage can block the Preacher single-handedly. So that was a really good turn for me. My opponent plays Floodpitch Drowner, and they're going to tap down my Hexmage, which is fine. They're going to attack with Preacher. And at least they didn't draw a card off that. And I drew a land, which is not bad. I can play Unholy Annex, and then I'm going to be able to put a counter on something. So now I have a few good options here, but it does seem like putting a counter on the Deep Cavern Bat is probably best because it's going to balance out the 2 life that I'm going to lose from the Annex because I'm going to gain 2 life, right? The Bat has lifelink. So that's what I'm going to do. And now I'm just going to attack with all my flyers. So 2 really solid turns for me here. The previous turn, turn 3, playing the Scavenger, playing the Pixie, bouncing the Hexmage and replaying it, that was a really good turn. And then I drew a Bitter Triumph as well. And my opponent scoops. So that was a really good game for me. I played that much better than the first game. But I also got, I got unlucky having to mulligan down to 5, but then I did have some pretty good draws. So now that I'm on the draw, I do need to make some changes to my sideboard. I cannot just go full on trying to push for the way that my deck works. I do need to be a little bit more reactive. So what I'm doing here is I'm just cutting everything that I put in, and I'm just trying to reset a little bit and figure out what I want to do. So this is the deck list that I had, and now I'm just going to kind of start clean and think about what I want to do with my sideboard now that I'm on the draw. Cutting an Annex on the draw does seem good. Putting in an Exercise for Enduring Curiosity. Cutting a Hexmage and a Scavenger to make room for some more removal does seem like a good idea. I can put in the Bitter Triumph and another copy of Seamrip. This already seems pretty good. Again, the Momentum Breakers are not very good in this matchup, so instead I can put in a Shoot the Sheriff and 2 copies of Sunset Saboteur. This is looking like a pretty good sideboard. Sunset Saboteur will be a really good blocker, and again, if my opponent's going to interact with it, they're going to have to discard a card. So one of the cards that I really should put in here is Intimidation Tactics. I ended up not doing that, but I probably could cut a Sunproc here and here and make room for that Intimidation Tactics because Intimidation Tactics is pretty good against their deck. They run a lot of creatures. The other thing here is I could cut another copy of Annex and put in the Sage of the Skies again. Cutting this Get Lost and putting in Devout Decree does seem like a good option because Devout Decree will get rid of Kaido. That's why the Get Lost is in pretty much. And it can also get rid of Preacher. But then they don't get the advantage of having the map tokens. And they play a lot of creatures. Again, this is one of the disadvantages of playing Get Lost, which is that they have a lot of creatures and they can buff those creatures with the map tokens potentially. That being said, I do think I should have put in that Sage of the Skies and the Intimidation Tactics. Here's my opening hand for the third game. It really doesn't look that good, but it's probably not bad enough to mulligan because I do have a Nowhere to Run and I do have a Bitter Triumph. If I can get 1 white source, then I can start bouncing this Nowhere to Run over and over with the 2 Kirans and keep getting value from it. I thought up for a while about this, but I did end up keeping this hand, which I think was the right decision. I drew a second Zenith, which a rare thing to say, but that's actually bad. I would have preferred to have gotten a land. But there's my third land anyway. So, I'm certainly just going to hold up my instant speed stuff. My opponent plays a Floodpitch Drowner. Could be a good target for Nowhere to Run. But I'm going to wait to see if they do anything else on their turn. My opponent plays a Preacher, which is a good target for Bitter Triumph. So I'm certainly going to play Nowhere to Run on the Flood Pitch Drowner. No reason to not do that here. And I drew a Seam Rip. So I have some options here, because on my next turn, if I draw a land and if they have a smaller creature, I could potentially double spell with Zenith and the Seam Rip. I also have two Zeniths though, and I wasn't sure what to do. But it does seem like getting rid of this Preacher is the best option, because look at the life totals, 20 and 20. So if this Preacher attacks, my opponent's going to get both things, the token and the draw from the Preacher. So it's a really good idea to remove this Preacher with the Bitter Triumph. Instead, I played a Zenith. I played a Zenith because I was thinking, well, I have another one in my hand anyway, and next turn I can double spell, potentially. But this was a big mistake. My opponent has an Intimidation tactic, so they're going to get rid of the Zenith that's in my hand. It was not safe there. And then putting it on the field means it can also get removed. Terrible play on my part. This is a massive swing in my opponent's favor, and then I drew the 4th land, so I could have double spelled on this turn, potentially. Just a really, really bad misplay on my part. I played the Zenith because I was thinking, well, I can double spell next turn even if I don't get a land, and I have this other one in my hand as a backup. But against Dimir Midrange, it's better to recognize that something in your hand is not necessarily safe. I didn't see a Deep Cavern Bat in the first 2 games, but that doesn't mean that they don't have one. And again, Intimidation tactics make sense. I don't know if I could have necessarily had the foresight to know that they would have put that in, but still, huge mistake. It would have been much better to just play the Bitter Triumph and discard one of these Kirans so that they wouldn't get that double trigger from Preacher. So instead, now I'm way behind. I was able to remove the token with the Seam Rip, and now I can potentially bounce the Seam Rip at some point and replay it because there's nothing underneath it. But still, I don't really have anything that I can do here. So I'm going to play a Sunpearl Kiran. And at this point, it is better to take back the Nowhere to Run, because now I can play that Nowhere to Run on their Preacher and I can remove it. I drew a Shoot the Sheriff. So I actually do have a lot of options. I could potentially save this game for myself. For some reason, I decided to attack with this Sunpearl Kiran. I honestly don't know why I decided to do that. That was a big mistake. I was thinking, well, I have 3 removal spells in my hand. It shouldn't be a big deal, but look at my mana. I only have 1 black source, and I actually didn't realize that. Not only that, look at what my opponent is holding. They're holding up this much mana. They probably have an Enduring Curiosity if they're holding up that much mana. And if they're holding up Enduring Curiosity, then I definitely should have attacked with the Sunpearl Kiran, because then I could play Nowhere to Run on the Preacher, and I could play the other Sunpearl Kiran as a blocker. And boom, it is Enduring Curiosity. So now I'm really paying for my misplay of attacking. If I didn't attack with Sunpearl Kiran, I could hold up Nowhere to Run, hold up my other Sunpearl Kiran, hold up my instant speed removal, and then when my opponent plays this Curiosity, I can just wait and see what they do. If they attack with Preacher, which they might because of the life totals, then I can play Nowhere to Run on the Preacher. I can block it with the Sunpearl Kiran that's already on the field. If they attack with Curiosity, I can play the other Sunpearl Kiran and block the Enduring Curiosity with that, and then also pick up my Nowhere to Run. And then I can just hold Shoot the Sheriff for the Enduring Curiosity or another creature. It was a really big misplay to attack with that Sunpearl Kiran. I don't know why I did that. I think it was mostly because I wasn't paying attention to my mana, and that I'm realizing that I can only cast 1 of these removal spells, not 2. Because I did think that they could have Enduring Curiosity, but I was thinking I would be safe because I have so many removal spells, but I can only cast 1. Playing Shoot the Sheriff on this Preacher is probably a good idea at this point because I need to get it off the field. Again, the life totals are equal, so they would get the double trigger. But now I don't really have a good play against this Enduring Curiosity. I don't even think blocking it with Sunpearl Kiran is that good because there's nothing on the field to be bounced except for Seam Rip. I'd rather bounce the Nowhere to Run. So my opponent gets a free card draw off this, and I go down 4 life. My opponent plays a Kaido. could be a good target for Bitter Triumph. It's actually a little interesting that they decided to play that Kaido knowing that I have Bitter Triumph in my hand. So what I was thinking here is that since they didn't plus up Kaido, playing Kieran is probably not a bad idea because I can also potentially attack him with both Kierans and then save the Nowhere to Run on Enduring Curiosity. So this I actually do think was a decent play at this point to play the second Sun Pro Kieran. That being said, my opponent is holding something. So it could be a Flood Pit Drowner, it could be removal, any of those things. I drew a land. So now I'm going to go to combat and see if my opponent has anything. And they do. They do have a Flood Pit Drowner. So with that coming down, I really should just remove this Kaido with the Bitter Triumph. But again, if I had played 2 turns ago, if I had played that better, then my opponent wouldn't have gotten the triggers off of the Preacher and the Enduring Curiosity seemingly, or their Preacher would have just been removed. I could Bitter Triumph this Kaido. I could have played Shoot the Sheriff on the Enduring Curiosity or Nowhere to Run on the Curiosity. It would come back to my hand because of the second Sun Pro Kieran that came down. So really a couple bad misplays on my part. So I'm also attacking with the Sun Pro Kieran here, which is also not a good idea. I'm not sure why I did that. So now I'm going to play Bitter Triumph on the Kaito, and I should pay this 3 life instead of discarding that land. I would go down to 9, and then I would go down to 5 off of the Enduring Curiosity, but with the land, I can activate Soulstone Sanctuary on my next turn. Instead, I discarded the land, which maybe it doesn't end up making a difference, but now I can't activate the Soulstone Sanctuary. I don't have a second black source, so I was afraid of my life total, but at this point, it would have just been better to save that land. Tragic Trajectory on my Kieran, and I drew another land. So this game is pretty much over. I don't have much that I can do here. I can at least hold up Nowhere to Run and try to get rid of the Curiosity. Playing Nowhere to Run. And my opponent plays a second Curiosity. So they're going to draw 2 cards off this. My opponent plays another Tragic Trajectory. And I just drew a 6th land. So I really have nothing. All I can do is block the Curiosity with my Sanctuary. My opponent plays a Long Goodbye. There goes my Sanctuary. And my opponent is going to draw 4 cards off this. My opponent plays a Kaido. They draw another card. And I just drew a Shadowy Backstreet. So that's it. What I want to do now is actually rewind and see how this could have played out if I had played differently. So here's the turn where things started to go wrong, as I played this Zenith. Instead, I should have noted these life totals. They're the same. So my opponent is going to get 2 triggers off of this Preacher. Even if I play Zenith, that's not going to stop my opponent from attacking. It would have been much better to play this Bitter Triumph, maybe discard a Sun Pearl Kieran or just pay the 3 life, which might not have been so bad, and get this Preacher off the field. The fact that you get 2 triggers off of this Preacher, that should have been incentive enough for me to just remove it. Now that being said, it was a little unlucky for me. My opponent had like exactly the right combination of cards to just completely debilitate me and take away all my power. So if I had removed the Preacher, my opponent wouldn't have been able to draw a card. My opponent probably would have still played that Intimidation Tactics. They would have taken out one of my Zeniths. And then my opponent does have a Long Goodbye remaining, but I'm not too sure what the other two cards are. But they wouldn't have been able to draw a card off of that Preacher. So now the next turn, I should still have one Zenith in my hand. I can just hold up some Pyrokiran and bounce this Nowhere to Run if my opponent plays anything, and then replay it, because I'm going to have 4 mana. Now let's look at turn 5. This was the turn when I attacked with some Pyrokiran. I think this mistake is even worse than when I played the Zenith on the field, because again, my opponent had the exact right combination of cards to just completely remove the most powerful cards that I had. But this play, really, there's just no excuse. My judgment was really thrown off. I was kind of beating myself up a lot. I was talking to myself negatively, you know, scolding myself for putting the Zenith on the field, and I was just very distracted. But just look at what's going on here. If I attack with this Sun Pyrokiran, my opponent goes down to 16 life. So now we have the same life total again. Preacher gets both triggers. But not only that, the main thing here, my opponent has so much untapped mana. If you're playing against Dimir midrange and they have this much untapped mana, it probably means Enduring Curiosity. It could also mean Tidebinder, but it's probably Enduring Curiosity. So knowing that, I need to hold back this Sun Pyrokiran as a blocker, hold up Nowhere to Run, hold up Shoot the Sheriff, and hold up my other Sun Pyrokiran. Because then, if my opponent plays Curiosity, which they do, then I can stop my opponent from attacking by holding up these cards. I can Nowhere to Run on the Preacher. If Preacher attacks, they'll draw a card off it because my opponent will be at 18 life. And block with some Pyrokiran. I'll remove the Preacher. They won't get to draw a card with the Enduring Curiosity. Or if my opponent only attacks with Curiosity, I can use Shoot the Sheriff. I can use Nowhere to Run on it. I would probably play Nowhere to Run and then play the other Sun Pyrokiran, pick up the Nowhere to Run again. Or even if my opponent attacks with both, I can play Nowhere to Run, play it on the Preacher, block the Preacher with the Sun Pyrokiran that's already on the field, and then play the other Sun Pyrokiran, pick up the Nowhere to Run, and block the Enduring Curiosity. It would have been fine. I would have still stabilized even though my opponent took out both of my Zeniths. But this misplay attacking with the Sun Pyrokiran just set me way behind, and I just couldn't catch up after that. Again, like I said, my judgment was completely thrown off. I was really having a lot of negative talk with myself after the 2 Zeniths got removed, because I was very upset that I had played the Zenith there and just put it in harm's way instead of saving it. So that spelled the end of my run. This was the match that I lost, and then I was 1-1, and that was it. But I did go for a second run, so I want to talk about that one as well. But I didn't use this deck. Alright, so after my kind of disastrous run with Orzhov Pixie, I decided to try another run with a deck that I've always felt very comfortable playing, which is Dimir Midrange. This is now the 3rd time that I have featured Dimir Midrange on my channel. And once again, I did make some changes to the deck list in preparation for this qualifier play-in. So I'm going to put a link to my previous Dimir Midrange video in the description of this video in case you want to go check that out for a more detailed deck tech. I'm going to go through the changes. So the primary change is actually here in the 2-drop slot, and I made room for 3 copies of Azure Beastbinder. This card I think is really good in the current meta. It's most likely going to be unblocked, so it's something you could use to ninjutsu kaito, but also just having this ability to effectively turn off an artifact, creature, or planeswalker that your opponent controls is just really valuable. When I was first thinking about this card, I was a little bit concerned about the 1 power because it's not quite as much damage, but really the main thing here is the 3 toughness. It is much harder to remove. It doesn't get removed by Nova Hellkite. It doesn't get removed as easily with Fire Magic. In fact, they would have to pay 6 mana to remove it with Fire Magic. Burst Lightning, you have to Lightning Strike it or Abrade it or something like that. Just a lot of value in this card that is harder to remove. So I took out the 2 copies of Malcolm to make room for this, as well as a copy of Plumecreed Escort. I really like Malcolm. I think he performs very well, but just in the current meta, that 1 toughness is just too weak. For one thing, even trample creatures, he's a terrible blocker with trample creatures, and Beastbinder can at least absorb a bit more damage. Another change is here in the 3-drop slot. I took out the copy of Fablum Trick. I really like that card too, but again, the 1/1 flyers just not going to cut it for 3 mana, so instead I made room for another copy of Tidebinder. This feels like a good change. Tidebinder is a strong blue spell to be using in the current meta for sure. I'm personally still running the 4 copies of Kaido and the 3 copies of Enduring Curiosity. There are a lot of deck lists that are only running 3 copies of Kaido, and that kind of makes sense with mono red, because if you're going to ninjutsu in Kaito, well then they can just play a Nova Hellkite or Screaming Nemesis or whatever and then just attack Kaido because you seemingly don't have a blocker anymore because you took it back to your hand. But I still think that for pretty much every matchup except for mono red, 4 copies of Kaido, especially if you're on the play, is just really, really good. I still believe that ninjutsuing Kaido in on turn 3, especially if you're on the play, is just one of the best things that you can do in the entire format for turn 3. There are some slight changes to the interaction, so I added 2 copies of Tragic Trajectory. Previously, I didn't have Tragic Trajectory in because it's just sorcery speed -2/-2, which is just not a good spell. I mean, you might be able to trigger Void if you remove something else, or if you ninjutsu in Kaito, that's a way to potentially trigger Void, but really, you know, it's unlikely that's going to happen. You can't rely on the Void. But with the Beastbinder in here, the Beastbinder can make a creature base power and toughness 2/2. So this is a very nice combination here. The Beastbinder with the Tragic Trajectory. You can potentially use Beastbinder, target one of their bigger creatures, and then just use Tragic Trajectory to remove it. It's really good. I think that with Azure Beastbinder being in a good place, you can justify running more copies of Tragic Trajectory and potentially even like Stab for that matter. I removed 1 copy of Bitter Triumph to make room for a copy of Nowhere to Run. Bitter Triumph, just same thing that I was saying when I was reviewing the Orzhov Pixie deck. Paying 3 life in the current meta just doesn't feel that good. The meta's a lot faster now. Decks are a lot more aggressive. You could potentially even justify not running any copies at all, running like a Long Goodbye or something like that. But I have the copy in here. It hits not only creatures, but planeswalkers, and you're not limited to the mana cost 3 or less. Although instead of Nowhere to Run, you could potentially run the Long Goodbye. I like the Nowhere to Run. Being able to get rid of Hexproof and Ward does come around often enough. The +1/+1 counters with Orb Void, if they have an Innkeeper's Talent, they all get Ward. Sheltered by Ghosts gives Ward. Kaido obviously has Hexproof. A couple other creatures have Hexproof too. So I think Nowhere to Run is a fairly decent spell to be using right now. But again, this could just be a copy of Long Goodbye or something like that. I didn't really change the lands at all, but the sideboard does have a few notable changes. So I have 2 copies of Annul in here now instead of just the 1. Still have the Duress, but instead of Disdainful Stroke, I put in a Flash Freeze. This is, I think, a must-add in the sideboard if you have blue in your deck. Simic Stompy, mono green aggro, mono red aggro. There's so much green and red in this standard meta right now. Still add the negates, added another copy of Nowhere to Run in here. Again, gets around wards. It's also really good against Cruel Delirium and stuff like that. It would prevent the Hexproof from Overprotect, even though Overprotect would save the creature. But if you have this on the field already, then it prevents the Hexproof. 2 copies of Strategic Betrayal. I previously had 1 in here, but that sorcery speed just ain't gonna cut it. This just comes in against like Izzet Cauldron, Cruel Delirium, all those decks. Another significant change in here, 2 copies of Sunset Saboteur. Just like the Orzhov Pixie deck, this is an excellent blocker if you're on the draw. You got all these decks that target things, whether it's mono red or Dimir midrange for that matter, and then this penalizes your opponent for targeting this creature if they want to remove one of your best blockers. A 3rd copy of Tidebinder, another copy of Creature. This is another creature that I think is in a strong place right now. It's very hard to remove. You need an Obliterating Bolt, you need a Scorching Shot or something like that, or something like, you know, Long Goodbye, Shoot the Sheriff, etc. The fight spells in the green decks don't work because it has Death Touch. And then I still have the copy of Karsi Revenant in here. Unfortunately, despite the changes to the deck and despite Dimir Midrange being a deck that I'm very comfortable with, I still did not perform well 1-1, lost my second match, got kicked out of the run. But once again, I'm going to look at the match that I lost and do a deep analysis of the play-by-play to go over my decisions and talk about what I should have done instead. And hopefully that will be a valuable viewing experience. Let's take a look at the gameplay. All right, here's my opening hand of the first game. This does look pretty good. And I am going up against mono red. Starting with the Dream Thief. And I surveilled a Kaido, which is pretty good. I might not necessarily be able to ninjutsu this on turn 3 if I'm going up against mono red, but it could be relevant later. My opponent plays another Burnout Bastronaut, and they missed a land drop. So I actually have a chance. I'm looking pretty good here. Can certainly play one of the lands and then just hold up nowhere to run. No reason to not attack here with the Dream Thief because I can't block the menace creatures anyway. My opponent's going to get in for 2. Speed goes up to 3. And they play another Burnout Bastronaut. And they missed another land drop. So I'm certainly going to remove one of these guys, but I still have a chance. You know, they're missing land drops. Now, that being said, since they're missing land drops here, I made a really poor misjudgment here, which is I'm thinking that I'm just going to race them. So that's why I played this Kaido. Because I'm thinking that they're missing land drops. I can play Enduring Curiosity potentially on my next turn, or Preacher and a Dream Thief. And I also plussed up Kaido. This was where things already started to go downhill. It's never a good idea to race mono red, especially if mono red's on the play, even if they're missing land drops. Because look, they've already been hitting me for damage. I have 3 speed. I'm going to go up to 4 speed now if they attack me again. And then the Bastronauts are going to have double strike. Furthermore, given the fact that I did ninjutsu and Kaido here, I shouldn't have plussed him up. I plussed him up because I was thinking that they can't Obliterating Bolt him, but these decks don't typically main deck Obliterating Bolt. That's typically in the sideboard. Then they play a Razorkin Needlehead, so now that the Needlehead is down, I missed my opportunity to surveil and draw a card. I should have just seen that. If they hit a land, they can play the Needlehead. Then they can prevent me from drawing a card, so now I can't use Kaido's 0 ability. I missed my chance to use the 0 ability on the previous turn. Furthermore, I drew a second Kaido. If I had surveilled, if I had used the 0 ability, I would have binned that Kaido, and I wouldn't have drawn it. So even though I got a little bit lucky with my opponent missing a few land drops there, I botched it. I lost my advantage. I can at least play Dream Thief and play Preacher. So I surveil a Cecil on top. That's fine to keep there. It's a really good blocker. He can also flip into the lifelink version. So my opponent plays a Nova Hellkite. There goes Fairy Dream Thief. And now they can just remove Kaido even though I plussed him up because Nova Hellkite and Bastronaut can take him out. So that's what my opponent's going to do. And then the other Bastronaut is going to attack me. I also can't really use this Enduring Curiosity because the Needlehead is in play. I can't draw a card off of the Fairy Dream Thief exiling from the graveyard either, really. I attack with the Preacher here because I knew I was going to get the lifelinker. In retrospect, it is hard to justify that. It probably would have been better to just leave him back as a blocker. I surveilled a land. You could argue that I should have been that to try to find a removal spell because I haven't found one yet. Now, if my opponent attacks me, I can potentially block with Cecil to flip him into the Redeemed Paladin because I have less than 10 life. One other thing to note here is that if I had surveilled with Kaido, then I would have put the second Kaido in the graveyard, of course, but then I would have drawn that Cecil earlier, and I could have had Cecil on the field sooner, and maybe I could have already attacked and flipped him into the Redeemed Paladin, at least on the previous turn. So my opponent plays a second Nova Hellkite, and they're going to target my 1/1 lifelinker, which is really smart. And now I actually don't have very good blocks. If I double block with the Dream Thief and the Cecil to flip Cecil into the Redeemed Paladin, I actually lose the game because I'm going to take 4 damage from the Nova Hellkite, 2 damage from Cecil doing damage, 2 damage from the other Bastronaut that's unblocked, so that's 8 damage. I go down to 1 life. But then I lose the game off of the trigger from Razorkin Needlehead on my draw step. So actually, I had to block the Hellkite with the Fairy Dream Thief. But I also think it just would have been better to not attack with the Preacher on the previous turn. My opponent would have targeted Fairy Dream Thief with the Nova Hellkite, maybe attack with the Bastronauts, maybe not, because then I have Preacher and Cecil blocking. But then my opponent just plays a Screaming Nemesis, and that's the game. Because if I block the Screaming Nemesis, I take 2 damage, and then there's 2 damage going to get in from either the Bastronaut or the Razorkin Needlehead. So that's the end of the game. Really, I think the primary thing was not having Cecil on the field a turn sooner. Before the turn my opponent played the Nova Hellkite. I think the worst aspect about how I played that game, though, was trying to race mono red. Even though they were missing land drops, even though I had a powerful start with the Fairy Dream Thief and Ninjutsuing Kaido in on turn 3, that was just not the right thing to do. I could have just played that Preacher on turn 3 instead, or at the very least, I definitely should have surveilled with Kaido the turn that I ninjutsu'd him in, instead of doing the plus up. So now we're on to sideboarding. I'm certainly going to put in the Flash Freeze, and it also seems good to put in Tidebinder. There are many creatures that have triggered abilities. I decided to put in the Preacher and the Karsi Revenant as well, just to have good blockers. Take out the Fairy Dream Thief and take out the Deep Cavern Bats. This makes sense. The Dream Thieves, the Deep Cavern Bats, they're so vulnerable, they die so easily. The Preacher, Karsi Revenant, much better blockers, and now that I'm on the play, I can set up those blockers a turn earlier. I also decided to cut the Plume Creed Escort and put in another copy of Nowhere to Run. That also makes sense to me, because Nowhere to Run can remove the Screaming Nemesis or the Needlehead, any of those things. I also ended up removing this copy of Bitter Triumph and instead putting in 1 copy of Sunset Saboteur. Normally I only put in Sunset Saboteur on the draw, but in this case, paying 3 life again for the Bitter Triumph, just not a good idea. And instead, the Sunset Saboteur would just be a blocker. I probably won't attack with it because I don't want to buff my opponent's creatures. Here's my opening hand for game number 2. This does look pretty good. I'm just debating if I want to start with this tapped land or the swamp. It probably is better to start with the tapped land and then use the Flood Pitch Drowner. I can just play Cecil a turn after that or hold up Counter Magic or any of that stuff. I drew a Spyglass Siren, so still no 3rd land, but I can at least play that. And what I'm going to do here is actually what I would consider to be the first mistake. I'm going to crack this map token. I'm doing that because I'm trying to find my 3rd land. But I didn't have to. I didn't have to because I have Cecil. Instead, I see an Enduring Curiosity. I would have preferred to put that in my hand, but I have to bin it because I need to find my 3rd land. And I could have had Cecil on the field. Because what comes down on turn 2? Emberheart Challenger. It's mono red, of course. I would have had Cecil on the field. I could have had a blocker for that Emberheart Challenger. My opponent would not have attacked me. So now, I don't have an answer for this Emberheart Challenger. I can't play Cecil now. I need to hold up my Flood Pitch Drowner, hold up my Flash Freeze, and hold up my Counter Magic. Because what if they play a Nova Hellkite? So they play a Burnout Bastronaut. That's not a good target for Flash Freeze or Phantom Interference. And they play an Obliterating Bolt. So this definitely feels like something I should counter because I don't want to lose my only creature. And seemingly, I could have had Cecil on the field. They would have targeted the Obliterating Bolt on Cecil. And then I still would have had the blocker. Maybe they attack with Emberheart Challenger then. Maybe they don't because they want to remove my Cecil, but it would trade. You know, having Cecil on the field here would have made such a difference. Unfortunately, I still didn't draw my 3rd land. I drew an Azure Beastbinder. So, I can hold up Flash Freeze or Flood Pitch Drowner, or I could potentially play Azure Beastbinder as a blocker. Playing Azure Beastbinder as a blocker does kind of feel like it makes sense at this point because I can double block the Bastronaut or just block the Emberheart Challenger with it. My opponent plays a Nova Hellkite, targeting my Spyglass Siren and attacking with everything. This puts me in a tough spot. If I double block the Bastronaut, I lose my Siren. And really, my only good block is Siren on to Challenger for the trade. If I get my third land, then I can play Cecil and hold up Flash Freeze and Floodpitch Drowner, so that would actually not be so bad. This is my only good block. Unfortunately, still no land. But it is a nowhere to run, which is, I mean, that is useful at this point. Attacking with the Beastbinder, targeting the Burnout Bastronaut, this is good. And now I can hold up my instant spells and my flash spells. My opponent plays a second Nova Hellkite. That's a good target for Flash Freeze. Attacking with the Bastronaut, so it feels like they have a burn spell, like a Burst Lightning. I was thinking that it might not be so bad to make them use a Burst Lightning on my Beastbinder, but in reality, I think it was a mistake to do this block because Beastbinder can keep turning off the Bastronaut, right? And all that stuff. I still didn't get my third land, but I did draw a Shoot the Sheriff. So I do still have answers for what they're going to play, but losing the Beastbinder was a big deal. They play a Screaming Nemesis. I can play Nowhere to Run. I can play Shoot the Sheriff. Tapping it down with Floodpitch Drowner is questionable. Playing Nowhere to Run feels like the best use of the cards that I have at this point. Still didn't get the third land. Really unfortunate. I'm just not getting it. And I've seen a good amount of cards at this point because I did use the map token to bin the Enduring Curiosity. Still going to hold up Floodpitch Drowner and Shoot the Sheriff. My opponent plays a second Screaming Nemesis. I'm going to use Shoot the Sheriff, which I was hoping to save for Nova Hellkite. But I can't really leave Screaming Nemesis on the field either because I can't really block it. So now I'm going to go down to 4 off of this Bastronaut. Still didn't get the third land. And I drew a Carsey Revenant, which would be nice to have on the field right now. My opponent plays Nova Hellkite. I can at least tap it down with Floodpitch Drowner. But now I'm going to go down to 2. Finally got the third land. So at this point, I have to play Carsey Revenant. I can't play Cecil. I'll lose the game if he blocks. And I can at least attack with the Floodpitch Drowner. And my opponent finishes me off with a Lightning Strike. So that was really unfortunate. I didn't hit a land drop for a long time and I surveilled away a card and I still didn't get the land. So it seems like there just wasn't really anything I can do. But why don't we rewind and see what other options I had? This is the turn where I started to fall behind. Seemingly using the map token here is a good idea because I can potentially find my next land. However, playing against mono red, you have to recognize that on turn 2, there are 2 creatures that can come down, Razorkin Needlehead or Emberheart Challenger. If it's Razorkin Needlehead, okay, that's not immediately threatening, but Emberheart Challenger is. I have the answer to Emberheart Challenger sitting in my hand. It's Cecil, and I didn't play him. And I got punished for it because my opponent plays an Emberheart Challenger, and having this Cecil on the field would have made a world of difference. He would have just stayed there for multiple turns as a blocker, preventing my opponent from getting damage in. So cracking this map token on this turn was a mistake. So now at this point, I should have Spyglass Siren as a 1/1, Cecil, and the map token. My opponent probably wouldn't attack with this Emberheart Challenger. Maybe they wouldn't have played Emberheart Challenger. Maybe they would have done something else. So now on turn 3, I wouldn't have this Flash Freeze in my hand. It would instead be the Enduring Curiosity that I put in the bin using the map token. I should have Siren, Cecil, and the map token on the field. So now I can hold up the Floodpits Drowner and the Phantom Interference. I also should not attack with the Spyglass Siren and just leave it back as a blocker. That means that at this point, my opponent would theoretically play the Obliterating Bolt to get rid of my Cecil. It's possible that they had this in their hand already and they would have removed him on the previous turn. If they removed him on the previous turn, then I could play my second copy of Cecil, and then they would potentially play their copy of Emberheart Challenger that they wouldn't have played on the previous turn. If they do play the Obliterating Bolt on this turn to try to remove my Cecil, then I can use Phantom Interference to counter it and leave my Cecil on the field. Emberheart Challenger is now a 3/3. Maybe my opponent attacks. If my opponent attacks, I block with Cecil and I go down to 18 life. However, I would find it unlikely that my opponent would just throw the Emberheart Challenger away. They might want to wait until they get another removal spell for Cecil. Another thing to note here, now that the Bastionaut is on the field, my opponent has speed. But the speed would not go up this turn because my opponent wouldn't be able to do damage to me with Cecil still on the field. So my opponent would remain at 1 speed instead of going up to 2. Turn 4, I should still have the 1/1 Siren, the Cecil, and the map token. I would not have the Azure Beastbinder. It would instead be that copy of Flash Freeze, and I would still have the Enduring Curiosity in my hand. I can't attack here. I just leave my blockers, Spyglass Siren, Cecil, and hold up my counter spell. Now on my opponent's turn, they would cast the first Nova Hellkite, which I would then counter with the Flash Freeze. After that, there are a few possibilities. I know at some point my opponent has a Burst Lightning. I'm just not sure if they have it in their hand right now or if they draw it on their next turn, because they used that Burst Lightning to get rid of the Beastbinder that I played on the field. If they have the Burst Lightning in their hand right now, it's likely that they would use the Burst Lightning to remove my Spyglass Siren, because then they can certainly attack with the Bastionaut since the Bastionaut has Menace and I would only have Cecil left as a blocker. Furthermore, Prowess on the Emberheart Challenger would trigger, and Emberheart Challenger would be a 3/3, so it could seemingly trade with my Cecil. I think at that point, it's likely my opponent would attack with the Challenger as well, and now I would need to decide if I'm going to block with Cecil or not. Now my opponent did play a second Nova Hellkite. It's possible that they have this Hellkite in their hand right now, and instead of using the Burst Lightning to remove the Spyglass Siren, they'll just use that second Nova Hellkite to try to remove the Spyglass Siren. If that's the case, then they probably wouldn't attack this turn, because I can double block the Bastionaut, I would lose my Siren, but they would lose their Bastionaut, and they certainly wouldn't attack with the Emberheart Challenger since I can block it with Cecil, and Cecil will remain on the field. It's also possible that they simply don't have the second Nova Hellkite yet or the Burst Lightning, and they would just not attack this turn, and I would keep both of my creatures. Out of those possibilities, the worst case scenario is that they use the Burst Lightning on my Spyglass Siren and then attack with both creatures. So why don't we say that that happens? In that case, it is in my best interest to block the Challenger with my Cecil, since I have another Cecil in my hand, and if I finally get a third land, which I didn't end up getting for a few turns, but I don't know that, then I could play that second Cecil and still hold up Floodpits Drowner. So, taking all this into account, the Nova Hellkite gets countered, my Spyglass Siren gets removed, the Emberheart Challenger trades with Cecil, and the Bastionaut attacks me directly. I would go down to 17 life, and my opponent would go up to 2 speed. The next turn, I don't have this Nowhere to Run in my hand. I instead have the Beastbinder. But I do still have Floodpits Drowner, so I still have an answer. I still have an answer every single turn. So now my opponent plays the second Nova Hellkite. I don't have a counterspell for it. I've already used my Flash Freeze, and I used my Phantom Interference to counter the Obliterating Bolt. But I have Floodpits Drowner. So I can play the Floodpits Drowner in response and tap down the Nova Hellkite. Now tapping down Nova Hellkite actually isn't that great because it won't keep that stun counter since it was warp. Once it leaves the battlefield, it will no longer have that stun counter when my opponent replays it. However, my only other option is to tap down the Bastronaut, and with my opponent having a speed of 2, that Bastronaut is not going to get double strike for a couple more turns. It definitely feels like tapping down the Nova Hellkite and preventing that 4 damage is more value provided by the Floodpit Drowner, as opposed to tapping down the Bastronaut. So, my opponent plays Nova Hellkite, I tap it down with Floodpit Drowner, and then my opponent can attack with the Bastronaut. I go down to 16 life, and my opponent goes up to a speed of 3. On my next turn, I would not have drawn this copy of Shoot the Sheriff. It would instead be the copy of Nowhere to Run. Now since my opponent's Bastronaut is tapped, I can actually attack here with Floodpit Drowner because it has Vigilance. But before I attack, there's a couple things that I need to consider. My opponent has 4 lands. If they get 1 more land, then they can replay that Nova Hellkite, and they would seemingly target my Floodpit Drowner and my Floodpit Drowner would die. I also currently don't have a good target for this Nowhere to Run other than the Bastronaut. Since the Bastronaut doesn't have double strike yet, it's not a very good use of the spell. Maybe my opponent will play something else that I would rather use the Nowhere to Run on. So it might not be a good idea for me to hold up my mana for Nowhere to Run, and really, more importantly, there is a way that I can prevent losing my Floodpit Drowner to this Nova Hellkite, and that's using the map token. This feels like a good turn to use the map token, because if I hit a land, hopefully it's untapped, then I can play it and hold up Nowhere to Run. If it's not a land, then my Floodpit Drowner gets a +1/+1 counter and it will not die to Nova Hellkite. Then I still have 1 mana left over to play my second copy of Cecil. I would now have 2 blockers for the Bastronaut, and if my opponent plays the Nova Hellkite, I can't block that anyway. This feels like the turn that I should have cracked the map token. So if I do that, the card that would be revealed is the copy of Shoot the Sheriff that I would evidently draw on my next turn. Even though I do need to find my 3rd land, that Shoot the Sheriff is my only answer right now to that Nova Hellkite, which could very possibly come down on the next turn. So it's in my best interest to leave the Shoot the Sheriff on top. Floodpit Drowner is now going to be a 3/2, and then I still have 1 mana left to play my second copy of Cecil. Furthermore, as I said earlier, the Floodpit Drowner has Vigilance, so I can attack with it. My opponent will go down to 17. Now my opponent's turn is really interesting. In the actual match, this was the turn that my opponent played the first copy of Screaming Nemesis, so they have that in their hand. They also did play a 5th land, so they can either play Nova Hellkite or Screaming Nemesis. If I didn't have 2 blockers for the Bastronaut, it would be a good use of my opponent's mana to play Screaming Nemesis and then use the remaining 2 mana to give the Bastronaut +1/+0. This would be a total of 5 damage. However, with 2 blockers, it's unlikely that my opponent will attack with the Bastronaut here, especially since it doesn't have double strike yet. So a better use of my opponent's mana would be to play Nova Hellkite. But my opponent will not be able to kill one of my creatures, since the toughness is too high. I want to see how this would play out with either scenario. One in which my opponent plays Screaming Nemesis on this turn, and the other in which my opponent plays Nova Hellkite on this turn. Regardless of which creature comes down, my opponent is going to attack with it. So I want to start with looking at the scenario of my opponent playing Nova Hellkite, since seemingly that would be more damage this turn. So my opponent plays Nova Hellkite, targets one of my creatures, and then attacks with the Hellkite. I go down to 12 life, and my opponent goes up to a speed of 4. On my next turn, I would not have drawn this Azure Beastbinder. Instead, I would have drawn the copy of Shoot the Sheriff that was revealed on the top of my library. I also still have this Nowhere to Run in my hand. It is not on the field. I'm for sure not going to tap my mana to leave up my removal spells. However, I can potentially attack with both creatures on this turn. The Bastronaut does have double strike, so if I attack with the Floodpit Drowner, the Bastronaut and Floodpit Drowner might trade. But with the Bastronaut having double strike, and my opponent having access to a lot of mana to increase its power by +1 or more, I would find it unlikely that my opponent would want to block with the Bastronaut and trade with the Floodpit Drowner, especially since Floodpit Drowner still dies to any burn spell. And certainly my opponent would not block Cecil because the Bastronaut will not trade with Cecil. This means that I can safely attack for 5 with both, and then not only that, when Cecil does damage, I will be at 10 life and he will flip into the Redeemed Paladin, and I will have a 4/4 lifelinker. So that's what I will do on this turn. I will attack with both creatures, my opponent will go down to 12, and I will go down to 10. But Cecil will flip into his Redeemed Paladin version. Now my opponent's next turn is really interesting. They still have that Screaming Nemesis in their hand. But in the actual game, this was the turn in which they played the second Screaming Nemesis, so they also have that in their hand. Furthermore, in the actual game, they did not play a land on this turn, meaning the third card in their hand is not a land. It's most likely that Lightning Strike that they played a couple turns later for lethal damage on me. So they have a lot of options. They know that I have a Shoot the Sheriff in my hand, so they might try to do something to bait out this removal spell for me, but they don't know that I have the Nowhere to Run. Most likely they will attack with this Nova Hellkite, and I will destroy it with Shoot the Sheriff, but they have several options for other things they can do. They could also attack with the Bastronaut and tap 4 lands to give it +2/+0. With the double strike, this will be enough power to kill both of my creatures if I double block it. But Cecil Redeemed Paladin will do damage, so I will gain 4 life and go up to 14. They could play 1 copy of Screaming Nemesis and then attack with it. I would not block because I don't want to get that emblem from Screaming Nemesis that I can't gain life for the rest of the game. If they attack with Hellkite and Screaming Nemesis, they might still attack with the Bastronaut, because I would double block and then they can still tap 2 mana to give the Bastronaut +1/+0. And with the double strike, that will be enough damage to take out my Cecil, but I will gain 4 life in that case. Alternatively, they could just play Screaming Nemesis and not attack with it, just leaving it as a blocker, and then attack with the Bastronaut, tap 2 mana to give it +1/+0. Or play the Screaming Nemesis, attack with it, and then leave the Bastronaut back as a blocker with again 2 mana available to give it +1/+0. But there's even more, because they could just use 2 mana to Lightning Strike my Floodpits Drowner. They could also potentially just Lightning Strike me directly. Using the Lightning Strike on the Floodpits Drowner allows the Bastronaut to attack. They could use 2 more mana to give it +1/+0, or they could use the 3 remaining mana to play Screaming Nemesis and either attack with it or leave it back as a blocker. If they attack with the Bastronaut and tap 4 mana to give it +2/+0, I would then be tempted to remove the Bastronaut with the Shoot the Sheriff, because again, if I double block, I will lose both my creatures to the double strike. It's a total of 6 power, and I have a total of 6 toughness. If they don't do that, then I will play the Shoot the Sheriff on the Nova Hellkite. It so happens that since I have this Nowhere to Run in my hand, none of these possibilities are actually that severe for me. But there's even another possibility. Now that I have this Cecil Redeemed Paladin on the field, they might want to play this Screaming Nemesis and then use Lightning Strike on it, seemingly to bait out my Shoot the Sheriff and use it to remove the Screaming Nemesis in response. With another Screaming Nemesis in hand, if the first one gets removed with Shoot the Sheriff, then the second one can be used as a blocker, and then my opponent can still attack with the Nova Hellkite each turn. However, if my opponent is really clever, then what they'll do is play the Screaming Nemesis, leave the 2 untapped mana, and attack with just the Nova Hellkite. I would undoubtedly use Shoot the Sheriff on the Nova Hellkite, but then, in response, my opponent can use Lightning Strike on their own Screaming Nemesis, and then they will deal 3 damage to me, and I will no longer be able to gain life for the rest of the game, shutting off Cecil Redeemed Paladin. It is a little bit self-deprecating for them, because they lose their Nova Hellkite and they lose their Screaming Nemesis. They only have a Bastronaut in play. But without me being able to gain life for the rest of the game, they might just try to grind it out and burn me, or even simultaneously hold back their second Screaming Nemesis as a lethal blocker. There are so many possibilities here, and it's kind of impossible to deter what my opponent is actually going to do. However, based on all of the information that we have right now, the most devastating line for me is that my opponent plays the Screaming Nemesis and leaves up the 2 mana. My opponent then attacks with only Nova Hellkite, and I remove it with Shoot the Sheriff. Then, on my turn, I would use Nowhere to Run on the Screaming Nemesis. In response, my opponent will use the Lightning Strike on that Screaming Nemesis, deal 3 damage to me, and now I can't gain life for the rest of the game, turning off my Cecil Redeemed Paladin and any other lifelink options that I have in my deck. I then can only attack with Bloodpitch Drowner because I need to hold back Cecil the Redeemed Paladin as a blocker for the Bastronaut. Unbeknownst to me, my opponent has the 2nd Screaming Nemesis. They can play that on their turn, and they might even attack with it, because I'm at 7 life now, and I can't gain any of it back. If I block with either creature, my life total gets lower. If I don't block, my life total still gets lower. Now that being said, in a couple turns I will finally get my 3rd land, and then be able to play that Karsi Revenant. It won't gain me life, but it does have Death Touch. I didn't see what was on top of my deck for the turn after that. There is a good chance that it was a 4th land. If it's a 4th land that's untapped, I could play Kaito and stun one of their creatures. But obviously, look, we could spend forever speculating on where the game goes from here. The point that I'm making is that there was a way out in this game for me. Even though I didn't draw a land for several turns, I saw several cards. It was something like 8 cards, and I didn't get that 3rd land. Even despite all that, there was a way out. Now look, hindsight is 20/20. And honestly, yes, I did watch this footage a few times over and spend considerable amount of time thinking about how I could have survived this game. And it's very unlikely that I would have seen this exact line of play to be able to stabilize. And it's also just really unlucky for me that I had to go this long without getting a land. But putting all that aside, the key thing here is that all the way back on the 2nd turn, I made a mistake. I cracked this map token on the Spyglass Siren instead of playing Cecil. And Cecil being on the field would have made such a difference. Look at how much life I would have been able to preserve, how many times my opponent wouldn't have been able to attack into me because I had Cecil on the field, unless they wanted to trade one of their creatures. I would have survived. I would have been able to be more liberal with my answers to my opponent's threats, because really, even though I wasn't drawing a land, I was drawing an answer every single turn. I drew a Flash Freeze, I drew a Nowhere to Run, I drew a Shoot the Sheriff. There was one turn in there when I drew a Beastbinder and that wasn't that useful, but still, I had answers. So seemingly I could have survived if I just had that Cecil on the field on that 2nd turn. It's so easy to just blame it on the game and blame it on your chances and all this unfortunate things that happen, but there still was a way out, even with chances, even with the smallest margin. Looking through this footage and taking the time for me to recognize that there was still a way out, that's just the mindset you need to have, myself included. It's the mindset that we all need to have when you're getting unfortunate draws. What is your way out? How do you survive? Don't just accept defeat. Don't just crack a map token for the sake of cracking it. Crack it at the right moment. So I want to summarize a few key points here from looking at the gameplay from both of these matches. Firstly is don't just do things. That's effectively how I played both matches with the Orzhov Pixie and this Dimir midrange. Don't just do something for the sake of doing it. Instead, look and see if you have a better way to potentially respond to what your opponent has or what your opponent could have. Secondly, don't let fear cloud your judgment. This is definitely what was happening to me in both of these games. Don't let fear cloud your judgment and instead just see things for what they are. The board state, what you have in your hand, what options you have. Just see it for what it is and not something more than that. Third thing, which is especially relevant here in this mono red matchup, is to know your outs. Is there a way out? Is there anything that you can do? Use what you have as best you can to give yourself an out. Because again, that's what was happening in this second game. I had the outs, I had the answers, and really, if I had just played that Cecil on turn 2, I probably would have been able to survive. And the last thing, as cliche as it is, and actually, you know what? I'm not even going to say this. I'm going to let someone else say it for me.
You don't give up. You find a way. Right. So,
as cliche as it is, it's absolutely true. Don't give up. Find a way. Find a way if there is one. Jim Davis recently put out a video where he was doing an analysis of one of the games from Orlando at the SCG event. And what he was explaining is that even in those matches where maybe you only have like a 10% or a 5% chance of winning, if you can find it, then that puts you a step ahead of everybody else, because everybody else would just not see it or would just give up or whatever. And furthermore, he said that the best players, at least at the pro level, maybe they have like a 60% win rate or something like that. But if you can find those outs, if you can get those marginal victories, then maybe your win rate is not 60, it's like 62 or 63 or maybe 65. And that could be the difference. That could be the difference between you being a good player and an exceptional player. It's just those few percentage differences. So look, these things don't necessarily apply to just playing on the ranked ladder. I would say don't take the ranked ladder games too seriously. Treat them as a way to experiment, treat them as a way to learn, treat them as a way to try out different synergies and try out different cards. But when it comes time to really play, if you're doing a qualifier play-in, if you're doing a qualifier weekend, if you go to a tournament, if you're participating in a challenge, if you go in an RCQ or whatever it is, that's where it's time to ice up and just don't give up. Find a way. Find a way and know your outs. So that wraps this one up. A very different video for me, and I'm still disappointed in my performance, and really I was hoping to give a much better performance, especially with the Orzhov Pixie, because so many people wanted to see it. So I'm sorry that I kind of let some people down in that regard and you didn't get to see really outstanding gameplay with that deck. I am still brewing with that deck though, so I think it's likely it will show up again on my channel. And again, I hope that this video proved valuable. It certainly is valuable for me to go through my gameplay like this and talk about it in such detail. And I hope that it provided some benefit to you as well, and that you enjoyed this different style of video. If you did enjoy, drop me a like to beat the YouTube algorithm. Leave me a comment. I love hearing your feedback. Maybe you see a different line of play that I didn't mention. Maybe you have a point to make about the decks that I chose and cards that I could have used instead or should not be using. Keep in mind that it's not just me reading the comments, it's also other people. So if you have some input to share, it could not only be helpful to me, it could be helpful to somebody else who reads your comment too. And lastly, if you are a fan of this kind of Magic the Gathering content that gets deep into gameplay, deep into deck building, and deep into card synergies, then subscribe to the channel to see more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.